I'm so confused.
This time last week, you'll remember many schools were closed, bins left uncollected and some NHS operations cancelled. The Prime Minister called it a damp squib, but there could be further public sector strikes in the coming months. The disputes prompted some MPs to question the role of taxpayer-funded union representatives working in public sector organisations. Union reps like nurse Jane Pilgrim. She came to prominence earlier in the year when she spoke out against NHS reforms. Her surname is now being used by critics who refer to union reps as pilgrims. The trade unionist's journey is certainly not an impoverished one, according to research by the Taxpayers Alliance Pressure Group. Trade unions received £113 million of funding from taxpayers in 2010-11. This includes £80 million in paid staff time. The Taxpayers Alliance has extrapolated that this means 2,840 full-time equivalent public sector staff worked on trade union activities. It found the organisation with the highest number of employees working on trade union activities was the Department for Work and Pensions, with 308 full-time equivalent staff. Birmingham City Council had nearly 62 full-time equivalent staff, and the top police force was the Metropolitan Police Force, with 16 full-time equivalent staff undertaking union duties. Aidan Burley heads the Conservatives' trade union reform campaign.
Well, I think people will be astonished at the level of public subsidy to the trades unions. Over £130 million a year of their taxpayers' money, not going on frontline services like doctors and nurses, but directly funding those organising the strikes and the chaos we saw last week. I agree with the Prime Minister, this can't be sustained morally or economically, and that's why I'm campaigning to end this Spanish practice.
Aidan Burley there. Well, Rachel Reeves, just picking up on that. I mean, in these times of austerity, you could be forgiven for thinking the public might say, well, look, let's not cut police officers, nurses, libraries. Why don't we cut taxpayer-funded union officials?
Well, obviously, you've got to get value for money, but I worked in the public and private sector before becoming an MP, and when I worked in the private sector, I was a manager, and we negotiated with the seconded people from the unions when we were going through any sort of change in the organisation over pay and the rest of it, and actually that was really valuable. So it's not just something that happens in the public sector, it happens in the private sector as well.
You said yourself value for money. You think you're not getting value, or we're not getting value for money at the moment, looking at the numbers of people
well,
that
it's
are...
up to the individual. The way it works is that an employer and employees come together and decide the number of seconded people. They're not union staff, they're staff that work for the organisation,
yes,
whether it's the police or the health service, who are seconded to represent the employees in that organisation, and that's what happens in the private sector.
OK, but why don't the unions pay for these posts? Bearing in mind these people are doing trade union work, why don't they pay for it?
Well, they're doing the work of representing people in the workplace, representing the employees, and in the same way that you have big HR functions in any large organisation, the employees of an organisation also need someone to stand up for them, represent their interests.
It's not quite the same, though, is it? I mean, if you're representing your employees, you're doing trade union work, basically, aren't you, on behalf... You know, we have some of those in the BBC. Why don't the unions pay for the posts?
Well, because they are representing people in the workplace, and it's not that they're doing trade union work, they're doing work of supporting the people, the nurses, the doctors, the BBC staff, or whoever it is. And actually it helps those organisations because you have somebody to negotiate with.
Do you think,
whether it's on pay conditions change and the rest of it?
2,840 full-time staff working on trade union activities, do you think that's too many?
But that's it across the whole of government, including all local
authorities.
It's a lot
of people, though, isn't it?
Also including the quangos and the rest of it. And I think you'll find that in the private sector as well, you will have people in all levels of the organisations, in different departments, representing
Let me come back to the
people
first
who work
question,
there.
though. In these times of austerity, and you said it's about value for money, who would you rather cut? One of those taxpayer-funded officials or a police officer?
Well, Labour have said that we wouldn't cut at the speed that the government
No, but I know, but you still admit you were going to cut, particularly in the police force.
Yes,
so who would you rather cut?
So
if you had to make a choice, and the public would have to make a choice, who would you rather see cut? Could we lose a few of those taxpayer-funded union officials?
If, for example, if you take the police force, Labour said that we would cut by 12% over the course of the Parliament compared with 20%. And the police representatives have said that that wouldn't mean a reduction in frontline support. So we think we could do it in a different way. But, you know, as the size of the public sector, as there are cuts, then that has to be proportionate across the whole organisation.
Might include them.
Yeah, I mean, and it's up to the employers and the employees to negotiate that, as it is in the private sector as well.
Do you think it's difficult, and the public might say, is it difficult because Labour and because yourself are so closely linked and dependent on the unions? Does that make it difficult for you to criticise it?
Well, I mean, I'm a member of a trade union, and I was in a trade union when I worked in the public sector and the private sector, and was represented by my union. I'm proud that the Labour Party was formed out of the trade unions representing working people. Does it make it difficult
for you in these times to criticise that link, bearing in mind the unions contribute 86% of all the money Labour receives?
Well, actually the main funder of the Labour Party are party members through their subscriptions and their donations.
How much do you get from Unite, the union that sponsored you?
I don't get any money from a trade union. My constituency party have an agreement with Unite, and we get, I think, the constituency party gets money towards the campaigning activities for the local elections and for the general election as well. But I don't get any money from a trade union.
What about this law on pilgrims, as we've called it? Is it going to change?
Well, I think when it's now all under review, I'd be very surprised if it didn't change. I mean, clearly we're sitting in the DWP, which has a big block of people.
Well, it seems to have the most.
Well, that's because we've got 100,000 staff. But,
well, but 308, I think it was.
Indeed, I mean, I think...
So you don't agree? How many would you like to see cut?
I don't agree. Look, I don't actually believe there should be full-time officials within the public sector.
What, none at all?
I'm very happy to see members of staff with union responsibilities being able to take some time off from their jobs to do their union jobs. But having full-time staff...
But you've just heard there from Rachel Rees that they do a valuable job. That's perhaps what smoothed, bar the strikes, industrial relations, working relations with their employees.
Look, we're spending £80 million a year, £80 million that could be spent on extra advisors in Job Centre Plus offices, that could be spent on extra nurses in hospitals, and that money fundamentally is going to the union movement, which is, I mean, for whatever Rachel says, the principal funder of the Labour Party. And indeed, we now have situations where there is clear evidence that Labour politicians are asking questions and tabling amendments in the House of Commons specifically at the request of trade unions.
If you talk to managers in the DWP who negotiate on changes in departments, on job losses, on pay and conditions, I'm sure they will tell you that it is helpful to have people there representing the employees in the workforce.
I don't have a problem
with
it
reduces the number of disciplinaries.
I do have a problem with not doing anything else.
It's the full-time activities that Chris Grayling is going. And I just want to clarify, it's the end of taxpayer-funded, full-time taxpayer-funded union officials.
Well, that's what I personally would like to see.
But you're happy to have two part-time rather than one full-time?
It's something that we're looking at considering. But I mean, my personal view is that within the DWP, I would like us to see us making time available for members of staff to represent union interests, but not for them to be just doing that. I think, you know, we should be talking about people who've got other responsibilities given some time to do their representative
Final
work.
word to Rachel Rees.
Well, if they're seconded for a year to represent people, a nurse seconded for a year to represent people who are also nurses in that hospital, I don't see a problem with that, and it can often ease tensions in the workforce, avoid disciplinaries,
except for the strikes, of course, that we've had recently.
But for 13 years, we had less industrial action under the last Labour government than we had for ever before. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, Andrew.